Now we have lots of different types of observational studies. I don't tend to test on these often, but they are potentially test worthy. So I'm going to breeze through them. Cross-sectional study, we just collect all of our data from a single time point. So a lot of what you'll be doing as part of your research projects is just a cross-sectional study. You're just going to collect data at this particular moment. Have you gone to tutoring? What's your GPA? Something like that. A retrospective study is one that looks backwards in times. This usually is when we find some group that has our outcome and then we ask them about what they did in the past and we compare them to some healthy control group. This is, we'll talk about it. I guess I have an exercise after that's about the pros and cons, but an example would be talking to people who have lung cancer and asking them about their smoking history. A prospective study is one that looks forward in time. You'll also sometimes see these called longitudinal studies. So let me go ahead and write that in case you care. This is the type of study I worked for when I was at UCSD. We were the Vietnam era twin study of aging, and what we did is we would have twins come in, and we would give them a battery of tests, some cognitive, some physical functioning type tests, and then we had them come back every 5 years because the idea was to try to figure out like the trajectory of how these people aged and how much of how they aged was due to genetics and how much was due to environment. That's why we needed the twins, that we could kind of separate this, because if you look at identical twins, their genetic makeup is 100% the same, and if you look at fraternal twins, it's only 50% the same. So you can use that knowledge to sort of figure out how much of something is due to genetics and how much of something is due to environment. Studies using what we call twin methods have shown that something like height is 80% heritable. So 80% of your height was determined by your genetics and 20% based on your environments, like what you were eating growing up and that sort of thing. So anyways, prospective studies follow people through for a period of time. So you can take a moment, think of some pros and cons that you might come up with for retrospective and prospective. If not, I'm going to break them down for you. So a positive for a retrospective study. Thinking about something like lung cancer, something that's not terribly prevalent in the US. You could go out and take a sample of 1,000 people, and you might get a handful that have lung cancer, right? If any. So you can't just do a cross-sectional study and say, oh, hey, let me know about your smoking history and whether you have lung cancer or not, because you're not going to get a very large sample. So retrospective is really useful when we're talking about rare outcomes. That looks like rave. Rare outcomes, right? Because in this case, I can say, oh, let me go find people who already have my outcome of interest. Let me find people who are in this situation, and then I'll just compare them to people who are not in this situation who are similar. That's a huge positive for retrospective studies. But a big downside of a retrospective study is, since we're asking them about the past, we're going to be dealing with a lot of what we saw in that research question on the first day of class. How much do they really remember about Saturday night, Sunday morning? We're going to have a lot of those midnight, I guess, what we would call recall bias, right? People cannot remember things perfectly. And we don't remember things. That's the way our memory works. It is not perfect intentionally. So that is a big problem with a retrospective study, is while we can look at rare outcomes, we know that our data is going to be potentially not so great. Prospective studies, on the other hand, since we're moving forward in time, we can collect all the data we want. We can ask people to journal. We can call them and survey them regularly. We can bring them across the country every 5 years. So that's the nice thing about prospective studies. We can also look at trends over time, which we can't necessarily do with any of these other types of studies, right? So those are two big pieces of why a prospective study is really useful. However, just like the census, the biggest downfall of a prospective study is that it takes a lot of time and money. When I first started at UCSD, one of the reasons I chose to work for that group was because I liked the idea of doing longitudinal data analysis. There's this like cool idea of like each time point is correlated with the time point before it, and the actual analysis is fun, but I came in while they were doing their second time point. So I didn't have longitudinal data, and by the time I left, we finally finished time point number 2. And it was going to be another 5 years before we had time point number 3. So we weren't having longitudinal data for another 5 years. And then, of course, the money, especially with that Vietnam twin study of aging. I don't remember how many twins we had anymore. It was like, I want to say in the hundreds. And we would fly them all to San Diego, put them in a hotel for 2 weeks of testing, including an MRI and all sorts of other stuff. So that was a very pricey study. Another issue, of course, is that we need to have common outcomes, right? If that's what we're dealing with, as opposed to rare. Because rare outcomes, again, doesn't matter how big your study is, you're not going to have that necessarily timed to some event if it's not going to happen for a large portion of your group. So those are the 3 types of observational studies. If I ask questions, they're usually about retrospective or prospective. One way I've asked questions about these is just giving you a scenario and asking you what type of study you would do. So just thinking back to, okay, is it something rare? Well, then I'd have to do a retrospective study. Is it not rare? Well, I could do a prospective study. I could follow them through until this happens. So keeping that in mind is pretty important in terms of how I like to ask questions about these 2 things.